Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Yellow Dirt by R. Alan Chappell, narrated by Kaipo Schwab. Chapter 1. Tsebi in the Sky. There is little to be said of a person who cannot provide for himself in his own land. A grandfather's words coming back to haunt the boy in those first hours after his mother's death. This was how the young Sam Klah was berating himself as sunrise brought a blush to the edge of the eastern mesas. Despite the overpowering grandeur of the Tsebi in the Sky, it can sometimes seem a desolate and barren place, and to those who know the legends, even more frightening. Hunger gnawed at the boy, though there was little to be done for it. There had been almost nothing to eat in the old Hogan for days before his mother died. Not that there ever was very much. With the sheep gone, there would be even less. The dwelling itself was gradually returning to the earth. Spring rains and summer storms had done their work with a vengeance. With little in the way of resources, the boy and his desperately ill mother found themselves unable to keep up with repairs. The unusually fierce winds and driving rains of summer had made life even more unbearable. The sheep, long sold for lack of feed, left the two with only a pair of old horses as a reminder of how they once had made their living. The horses might have been sold too, but for the boy taking them out each day to graze, secretly knowing he might someday have to go for help. Despite a long and deteriorating lung condition, death came unexpectedly to the widowed Lila Klah, as death so often does on the Dinè. Some believed her illness was tied to the scattered plots of yellow earth and piles of tailings that dotted the area, carelessly left behind by the uranium miners. No one would say this for a fact, only that the woman was not the first to fall victim to the yellow dirt, as it was called thereabouts. Her husband's death had come when Sam was still a baby, during the early days of the mining boom, a time when men were being lured to the work by offers of desperately needed jobs, the mining company leaving them ignorant of the consequences. Sam Kla's father was one of the first to succumb to the then unknown malady, leaving his wife Lila fearing for her infant son's health. The woman immediately abandoned their old place and moved to a distant Hogan once owned by a relative who had moved even farther away. The mining company, learning this first wave of deaths was causing others to leave their jobs, some even bringing claims against the owners. The companies quickly went on the offensive. Rumors circulated suggesting the deaths might be due to a witch's curse, one brought by spreading complaints against the mines. Fearing the loss of their jobs, miners and their families were gradually coerced into an uneasy silence. There were a few who questioned, but not one who dared make an outright accusation. The government, for its part, declared uranium a wartime necessity and critical to the defense of the country. They didn't let up, and in the end, the need for jobs proved stronger than the threat to workers' health. Later, many affected workers came to regret their failure to carry through, feeling they should have stood up for themselves from the start. By then, however, they too had fallen ill and would eventually suffer the inevitable consequences. As daylight gained a foothold against the black of night, there came the faint grind of a laboring vehicle. The boy lifted his head as the old Ford truck came into view, easing its way down the ridge in the dim glow of its headlights. He watched as the first glimmer of sunrise rimmed the mesa to see the driver navigate his way along the rough track running past the Hogan. While Sam knew who the truck belonged to, he had seen the person only occasionally these last few years. The man lived some miles away, making him a neighbor in name only, and then only within the context of the vast area. In his current state of mind, the boy had to think a moment to even recall his name. Only as the pickup truck slowed to a stop near the Hogan did it finally come to him. Irwin Johnson. That was his name. The man had been a frequent visitor after his father's death, often dropping by to see his mother several times a week, bringing a little canned food from the trading post, or occasionally some small shiny thing he thought might take her eye. Eventually, Irwin began spending more and more time at their place, often days on end. He paid little attention to Sam, rarely even speaking to the boy. Finally, over the course of a long summer, there came a falling out. The man harangued his mother for several days as they argued over something Sam wasn't old enough to understand. The upshot was that Irwin finally quit coming around, and young Sam had nearly forgotten him and his relationship with Shima. Years later, when the subject came up, his mother would refuse to discuss the man at all, saying only that he was a person who wanted too much but gave too little. "Is everything all right here?" Irwin demanded from a lowered window. The boy imagined his grim expression made it clear everything was not all right. Sam could see the man was in a hurry, on his way into town probably, clearly reluctant to involve himself in anything which might delay him. For his part, Irwin Johnson didn't feel any particular attachment or responsibility for this boy, but did have the state of his own Hojo to consider. Should he disregard so traditional an obligation to help a fellow Dinè in need? The failing might increase his debt to an already burdened karma. It was only this last concern that caused Irwin to ask the question again, and this time in an even firmer voice. "Boy, is there something I can do to help you here?" As he waited for an answer, he appeared to be looking the place over, taking stock of the poor state of affairs, which somehow seemed to bring a certain satisfaction. A grim little smile flitted across his face, but when he spoke again, the man forced a kinder tone. "I'm asking if there is any way I can help you here, boy." He said this to Sam in Old Navajo, as most in that country would be inclined to do. It was one of the few places left where a young person might be expected to understand the old way of speaking. Sam Klah lifted his eyes to the man with his first thought being that Irwin looked little different than the last time he'd seen him, and that was years ago. He would have thought the man would look some older now, like his mother, but that didn't seem to be the case. Perhaps it was her illness that caused his Shima to look older than she was. For some in that land, the years do seem to pass with little effect, yet there's no denying it's a hard land that favors very few in any regard. Slowly, the boy became more aware of a growing urgency in his visitor, a feeling which rankled something deep inside, making the young man uneasy and somewhat leery of the man. Finally, with a helpless sigh, he turned toward the Hogan and pointed with a trembling finger. Irwin Johnson could see then that the boy had been crying. "Shima," the boy murmured, and so softly the man could barely make out the words. As it sank in, Irwin gazed down the road a moment as though lost in a different time. Then, shaking his head, got down from the truck and moved closer to better understand the boy. "Is Lila bad sick?" he asked softly, but without any visible sign of emotion. The boy nodded. "She was very sick for a while, but no more." Choking back tears, he said, "I came in late from the horses last night thinking she was asleep. This morning I waited and watched to see if she might take a breath or make some movement." His next words appeared to catch in his throat. "There was no life left in her that I could see. After waiting there beside her for a while, I gathered what things I could and came outside." The boy cast fearful glances in the fading gloom. "I was afraid of the Chindi," he whispered. Then his voice failed, and he looked away, unable to continue. Even in that sparsely settled country, news gets around, and the sad state of the woman's health was common knowledge among the scattered residents of the area. Irwin Johnson, though initially reluctant to become involved, considered himself a proper-minded individual, who, when pressed, knew the right thing to do. He stared at the boy a moment or two, then edged over toward the Hogan, stopping just short of going in, or even peeking inside the shabby little dwelling. Buzzing flies and the faint cloying sweetness of death wafted his way, causing him to cover his mouth and draw back. Anyone growing up in those parts knows what death smells like. For Irwin, there was no longer any doubt. He straightened and moved away from the Hogan as a nearly imperceptible feeling of fulfillment settled over him. "Well, then," he finally managed, "we have some work to do, don't we?" Though he said this with a grim determination, it was clearly all he could manage not to turn and leave the boy alone. Sam watched as Irwin brought tools from his truck and began giving directions. The two of them fell to tearing wood from a broken corral gate, using it to board up the door of the shabby dwelling. When they had finished, Irwin fetched a small pickaxe. Someone who doesn't know the way of that land might have thought it odd, then, to see him knock a hole high in the side of the Hogan, that the Chindi spirit might escape should it take a notion. Some think it takes a while for the evil little phantom to gather itself, and most believe it will not fly at all in the dark. This made it reasonable to think it might still be inside, plotting its mischief. Their boarding up of the Hogan's door was mainly by way of warning to passers-by, letting them know this place now belonged to the other world, and posed a certain risk for the unwary. Thus marked, no one would enter, let alone live in this place ever again. It is a custom that has long meant hardship and trouble for those Dinè who survive the passing of a loved one inside their home. Required by tradition to abandon the dwelling, they are forced to leave and start anew. Even today, in an effort to prevent abandoning the family home, the old and infirm are sometimes, in their last hours, moved outside the Hogan, assuming, of course, there is time. Once outdoors, the little demon is free to leave if it chooses, that is, should it not prefer to hang around to settle some old score. When finished with the work, Irwin, as though deep in thought, looked past the boy, and in a detached voice said, "I will let the traitor know of your mother's death and what we have done here. He will notify the authorities, and someone will come to take care of the remains." He took great pains not to mention the woman's name, for fear this might guide the Chindi to them. This is how it has been since the beginning. With the coming of the white traders, however, much of this burden gradually shifted to them. In the early days, a trader might agree to handle the preparation of the remains, and sometimes even interment, relieving reluctant relatives of this onerous duty. Eventually, the trader might make himself indispensable to the community. It was smart business to show goodwill, as it was called. It was felt the trader was able to deal with the dead due to the general belief that white men had no soul, and thus were impervious to the Chindi's evil threat. To this day, a death may still be handled by a trader in this manner, there in those far reaches of the reservation where no one is the wiser. In any case, there was nothing more to be done as far as Irwin Johnson could see. His efforts should make it plain enough to passers-by that a dead person's Chindi might still be lurking here. He was now satisfied no thinking Dinè would venture near the place. His duty fulfilled, his conscience more or less clear, Irwin Johnson thus supposed himself free of further obligation. Now that everything had been done according to custom and to the best of their ability, the man and boy stood uncomfortably staring at one another. Irwin had, in fact, already turned to go when struck by a passing thought. Hesitating only a moment, he determined to say what was on his mind. "I've been knowing your mother since we were children. We always were good friends back then. In our later years I left here, and we did not see much of one another. But after your father's death from the yellow dirt, we became closer. I told her I was willing to move in here and help with the place, but she refused the offer. She thought it might interfere with some expected settlement from the mining people." He shook his head. "There was no settlement." With an almost melancholy glance at the boy, he gave a heavy sigh and made as though to leave, then turned back for a final word. Believing it only right he should offer some further token of kindness, something that might ensure a little more protection from Lila's Chindi, should it be bent on retribution for some past misunderstanding. He was thinking, "Fixing this thing will only become more difficult if I put it off. It would be best to take care of this now and be done with it, once and for all. Boy, I will take you into town, help you find a relative maybe, or at the very least someone of your clan who can help you through this." This small charity, he thought, should be enough to deflect any evil design the malicious little thing in the Hogan might be conjuring. The boy nodded his thanks, but was quick to decline the offer, saying in no uncertain terms that he was obliged to remain there. He still had horses to think of. They had to be taken to water, and feed found for them. Then, with a motion of his hand, Sam indicated the brush arbor where an old saddle and a few other poor possessions were piled together in a heap, offering mute evidence this was where he belonged for now. Looking toward the far horizon, he murmured thoughtfully, "I have an uncle over to the west, and maybe a little north of that, I guess. I will go to see him until I figure out what else to do. I have no other people that I know of." Irwin Johnson had expected Sam to say this, but tried not to look pleased when the boy confirmed it. He thought to himself, "This boy is smart enough to know he would likely wind up at child services should he go to town." Still, knowing it was only good manners and expected of him, he made a last perfunctory attempt, both to ease his own conscience and to preserve the state of his threatened hojo, knowing these two things were in essence pretty much the same thing. "Boy, are you sure that's what you want to do? It's a long way to town, and should you later decide you do want to go there, it might not be so easy to find a ride." He was testing the boy, and Sam knew it. Irwin frowned and went on. "To go to your uncle's might be even more difficult. It is a long, tough way horseback." He then thought to add one further thought, knowing it too had little chance of being accepted. "There will not be many people in that country who want to help you." This sounded weak and insincere, even to him, yet he watched closely to see what effect he might be having on the boy. It quickly became apparent the young man had, as he'd expected, already made up his mind. There would be no changing it. Sam Klah didn't hesitate in the least. "I'm sure this is what my mother would want, to find my uncle and go to him. He is my only relative and will be bound to help me. She mentioned this several times herself in the last few days." This was not strictly true, but he wanted to set the man's mind at ease to release him from any further obligation. There was something about this man that urged caution, though he couldn't say what prompted the feeling. "I will be fine. I've been to my uncle's place once before, with my mother, and I still remember the way." This also was only partially true. He didn't mention the trip had been a number of years back, when he was still quite young, or that he and his mother never actually found her brother's place. They later heard the uncle had moved a good distance from where they thought he lived, but Sam didn't know exactly where that might be. Nor did the boy feel it important to mention that this uncle was considered a little strange, according to what his mother said over the years. The man had never once in all this time made any attempt to visit them or evince even the slightest interest in seeing her, or in meeting his nephew. Irwin grimly recalled the boy's uncle from their childhood days, when they had often played together as youngsters. Oh, he knew John City well enough, and he listened now, thinking there were things this boy couldn't possibly know about his uncle. At this point he still thought it best not to persist in dissuading the boy. His case had already been made, the expected results now verified. Nodding thoughtfully to himself, the man turned once more to his truck and, giving the boy a curt nod, left him to his own devices. It was not unusual a boy this age should be determined to go his own way. It could be expected of any Dinè boy on the verge of manhood. The journey, hard though it might be, would certainly be more to the boy's liking than surrendering himself to child services. And then, too, he thought, my problem going forward might well resolve itself. As one forged in the crucible of so hard a land, Sam Klah was convinced he would inevitably dredge up the inherent survival instincts to see himself through any adversities that might confront him. This was how the children of the Dinè are taught to deal with life, and had done so through untold centuries. This young man's mind was made up, and there was nothing that would change it. From this time forward, Sam Klah would follow his own heart to make what he could of himself. Through the ages, man has been driven as much by curiosity as anything else, and it is the young that are more likely to pursue their vision beyond the next mountain, sometimes even farther, should they dream bigger dreams. Chapter 2. Independence. Sam Klah watched until Irwin's truck was out of sight, and only when the plume of dust had settled itself along the horizon did he take a deep breath and turn to the old Hogan wherein lay the last earthly remains of his mother. "Goodbye, Shima," he murmured quietly, with a last forlorn glance, and picked up his halters to begin working his way slowly down to the sage flats to retrieve his horses. The two old ponies were suspicious of being taken off their picket pins so early in the morning. In the way of their kind thought it might lead to work. Pulling back on their leads, they tossed their heads and stomped their feet in protest, as they grudgingly followed the boy up to the brush arbor. Pausing at the thought of what he was about to do, Sam Klah couldn't help feeling a moment of fear at the difficult and possibly dangerous path he had laid out for himself. From this day forth, he must try not to think of his mother. This was the way of his people, even from those ancient times when they roamed far to the north and well before they ventured into the sparse country they would later come to call the Dinè, Navajo land. It is embedded in the traditional Navajo mind that he should not dwell upon those who are no longer of this world, and must be mindful to keep them from his thoughts, never again to mention their name. None of this, however, could stop the tears as the boy saddled the gelding, then packed the mare with those few things he'd saved in the dark of morning. The mare, skittish and wary of the burlap bags slung from each side of the horn. They clanked and rattled each time she moved, and though she was old, she danced and snorted, stirring the dust which rose in a cloud, only to be carried away by an errant gust. A clear and calm day was in the offing, a good day to travel. Sam Klah was at last on his way to a new, and what he hoped to be, a better life. Thus, with never another glance at the old Hogan, the boy tore himself from everything he'd known. Taking up the mare's lead rope, he put his heels to the gelding's ribs, sending the reluctant pony up country in a ground-eating trot, the mare at times hard-pressed to keep up. He did not ease up on the old horses until they'd topped the ridge in a lather, only then stopping to let them blow and recover themselves as best their years would allow. Never once had any of the three looked back to their old home. By noon he judged they had come the proper distance. It was time to veer more to the west, putting the sun to his back as he again willed himself to think no more of the past. Sam Klah had gained only another mile or two on his new course when he came upon two boys on burros minding a small band of sheep. As he drew closer, he could see from the resemblance between them that they were most likely brothers. The two spotted him almost immediately, and, being curious as young boys are ever wont to be, they kicked up their donkeys and trotted over to see who he was and where he was going. "Ya te, the older boy called, pulling hard on the stubborn burro's rope hackamore, reining him in and causing the animal to do that little dance burros do when forced to defy their better judgment. "Where to, cousin?" The boy couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, but was obviously in charge of his younger brother, who he now motioned to stay back a ways. Sam Klah looked the pair over, noting their ragged clothing and worn sneakers, no worse than what he was wearing himself, though these boys did have on new headbands of rolled bandanas. He replied to their greeting in a non-committal sort of way, and watched as the younger of the two edged up even with his brother, that he too might be a party to the conversation. He seemed the more gregarious of the two, despite being a couple of years younger, and was clearly determined to have a part in any sort of talk his brother might instigate. It was obvious the pair saw few people out here, and probably still fewer strangers. Always, youngsters out here were hungry for news of the outside world and anxious to interact with their peers from far off. "Ya te," the younger boy finally managed, but in a thinner, less confident voice. "Where to?" he asked, mimicking the other. The older boy gave his brother, if indeed that's who he was, a sour look, and again motioned him back. Sam, unsmiling, gave a push of his chin to indicate he was headed west, though the boys had seen this plain enough already. "I am going to see my uncle," he told them finally, thinking they might by chance know something of the man. "He lives over that way," he said, motioning to the western horizon with a toss of his hand, but went no further than that. "What is your uncle's name?" the younger boy piped up again, as though determined to have some part in the thing. Sam tilted his head to one side and studied the smaller boy for a long moment without answering, then turned back to the older of the two and said, "My uncle's name is John Etzity." After waiting a moment, he asked further, "Have you heard of him? Maybe you know where he lives." At hearing the uncle's name, the two boys exchanged a wide-eyed glance, and the younger backed his burro up a step, as though suddenly through talking, and thinking now of home. Sam sensed these boys knew something, but asking directly would most likely make them even more suspicious. It was possible, however, they might eventually come back around to it, should he skirt the issue and talk of other things. People out here, he thought, often don't warm up to strangers until they know something about them. Sam eyed the older boy's burro. "That is a nice little teli you are riding. Did you catch him yourself?" The boy smiled a little at this. "No, my father caught this burro for me, but I'm the one who broke him to ride, and my brothers too. There's a lot of wild burros in this place. A person on a good horse can catch one pretty easy if he knows anything at all about burros." "Well, I guess your father knows something about them, to catch two as good as those." The boy beamed. "Oh, my father knows a lot about burros. He's caught a good many. He used to take them to the sale barn at Cortez to sell, but nowadays he says they don't bring enough money to make it worth his time." The smaller boy, intent on following the conversation, seemed determined not to miss a word. He nodded vigorously, and for a moment seemed about to say something, regardless of what his older brother might say. But then, thinking better of the notion, he looked down and remained silent. The older boy, taking a sudden interest in Sam's horses, said in an offhand manner, as though it was hardly worth mentioning, "That horse of yours is probably too old to catch a burro. My dad says they can run a lot faster than you think." Sam nodded affably enough, though he...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?